Has that ever happened to you? That was a dumb question. Of course it has. But it doesn't have to. And today, I'm going to tell you about why. Before we get into the meat of today's slides, I'd like to go over some of the more common types of capacitors. And there's 5 that come to mind. There's electrolytic, variable, film, ceramic, and supercapacitors. The ones we'll be focusing on today are the electrolytic and supercapacitors. But electrolytic and supercapacitors kind of flow into one another. Slight changes in the chemistry and physical construction of them can lead to better results, better batteries, and less dramatic situations. You have your positive cathode, which is here, and then you have your negative anode, which is here. And then in the middle, you have what's called a dielectric sheet. Now, the definition of something that's dielectric means that it can transmit an electrical force without being conductive, which basically means it acts as an insulator between the positive and the negative. So the forces between them can't actually interact, and they are therefore stored or trapped in the capacitor to be sent out whenever you need energy from it. In most cases, the positive and negative are a solid, like a metal, like iron or lithium in some cases. In other cases, they can be liquids. Some capacitors use salts dissolved in a solution, like sulfuric acid. These batteries or capacitors function because the salts undergo what's called a redox reaction, which is where one side of it is being oxidized and another side is being reduced. Redox. And what happens is the electrons travel across this wire, which is what you connect to your device, and those electrons give your device power when the metal or salt is becoming oxidized or reduced. And that's how a general battery or capacitor works. So you may be wondering, what are some situations where these capacitors or batteries are used? And you would be surprised to find out that they're used in literally anything you've ever held in your hand. In older cases, we have disposable batteries like Duracell, AA, AAA, that sort of thing. We went over this already. Older cell phones and older laptops also use electrolytic cells to give your phone battery. They're not very efficient, which is why we don't use them anymore. Supercapacitors are just one possible evolutionary form of an electrolytic cell. There's lots of different branches that all the different capacitors go down, but the one I've chose to focus on today is supercapacitors. So if you look at the slide that I've provided for you here, you'll see that electrolytic capacitors are only one branch off of the main capacitor family tree. And over to the right, you'll see that we have ceramic, variable, and film capacitors. And if you look down past electrolytic capacitors, you'll see that we have supercapacitors. And then to the right of that, you'll see we have fluoride-based cells, which we'll get into way later and is my own personal take on what I think is going to happen in the future, the direction that capacitors are going to take. So like I just said, supercapacitors are basically just a modern implementation of an electrolytic cell, which has existed for a surprisingly long time, actually. To describe more of what a supercapacitor is, we have to get into what makes it super. A typical electrolytic cell functions off 3 basic components. You have your anode, cathode, and your dielectric part in the middle, which doesn't allow for ion exchange and keeps the 2 different charges separated so that you can store the charge and then release it when you want it. There's several features about a supercapacitor which makes it much better than a typical electrolytic cell. Supercapacitors use 2 different layers of activated carbon on either side of the anode and the cathode. It serves as a very porous surface for all the ions from the lithium or from some other metal to bond to and kind of get tucked away in all the little nooks and crannies. Next, supercapacitors have 2 individual cells within them, whereas a typical electrolytic cell only has 1. So doing some basic math, you can imagine that a supercapacitor is about twice as efficient as a typical electrolytic cell would be. Finally, and maybe most importantly, in place of a dielectric sheet, they have a filter in between the 2 electrolytic parts of the cell. You can apply energy to the battery and it will move all the ions to one side, and then when you use the battery, they will all move back to the other side, which is recharging the battery, which is obviously important. The type of energy that's stored within a cell is directly proportional to the amount of energy that's stored within the ions in the cell. If we use something that has a much more electronegative charge associated with it, or something that has a +4 state, we can potentially store a lot more energy in a smaller amount of space. And there are 3 main reasons why we currently use lithium for supercapacitors in ion exchange. Number 1, Alkali metals have a very, very easily let go of electron in their outermost orbital, which means that these types of metals in that group are very susceptible to becoming ions or undergoing a redox reaction in a solution. Number 2. Lithium is an extremely light material, and as you go up and to the left, what we see is a decrease in weight because there's less protons in each individual atom of that element. Number 3 actually ties into the first reason. Because lithium has that free electron moving around its outermost orbital, it's actually extremely likely to give it up, but also to take it back when needed, which is why you see phones that can go from 0 to 50% in maybe 5 minutes. As you can see on the slide, as you move up and to the right of the periodic table, we see an increase in electronegativity. Electronegativity is the amount of energy stored within an individual atom per unit space. So if we move up and to the right, you can see an increase in the amount of energy stored within a single atom. Some supercapacitors have been made that use fluorine salts as their main source of ion exchange, and these batteries have been found to work extremely efficiently. The reason that we don't use fluorine in typical supercapacitor cells just yet is because they only function at about negative 337 degrees Fahrenheit, which for obvious reasons is a problem. Fluorine becomes paramagnetic when it achieves a very, very cold temperature. What this means is that at that extremely low temperature, fluorine actually becomes magnetic. That unpaired electron that only occurs at that very cold temperature is what allows for the ion exchange within the cell. Funny enough, there's actually a more common example of a paramagnetic property being achieved at an extremely low temperature. Oxygen, when it gets really cold, turns this kind of cool blue color, and it also behaves magnetically like a magnet. So now, you're probably wondering, how can we make these fluoride cells work at a temperature that you and I can both enjoy? I propose 3 different methods for making this work in the future. Number 1. I think that a change in the internal pressure within the cell would benefit. We know that the relationship between gas temperature and gas pressure is directly proportional. What this means is that if we were able to create a cell that had an extremely low pressure, we could achieve those lower temperatures without an external force acting upon it. Secondly, the current fluoride cell that was created was made using manganese. I think that if we were to experiment with different alkali metals or maybe even alkali earth metals down the periodic table, we would find a mixture that worked better and was more stable at room temperature and room pressure. And number 3, I think that an improvement in the amount of surface area and porous little holes that ions could bond to would make for a better battery that could be recharged and discharged more times without losing functionality. There's plenty of people out there with the same interests as you and I that are going to take care of this. And maybe, who knows, in the future you too can work into the development of better capacitors and better batteries to make the world all around just a nicer place. Thanks for watching my presentation.